So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Ooh, perfect. Okay, I know you guys have done this before, and you might roll your eyes at me, but I think it'll be a little bit fun. Yes, I know. We are going to do a review of last week in Kahoot format. Have you guys done Kahoot? Okay, you guys are like, oh my God, Kahoot. But it's fun though, right? A little bit? Okay, so pull out your phones. Jeez. All right. I'm sorry about the Halloween. I did not put that in Halloween mode, but I don't think we need the music. There we go. Okay, my people. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Good. We have a Cornelius in today's talk, so that's good. You'll be able to tell us about that. Yes, come. Open your phone. We're doing a Kahoot. So wait, who hasn't done Kahoot before? No one? Wow, it's really that? Okay. It's really popular. This was not a thing when I was in school. So. Right? Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think we have 2 more. Team mode? Okay, wait, what happened on yours? It's taking forever to load? Okay. Well, let's not disrupt your score, so you guys can team mode. Cool. And then we have one more. Oh, what happened? One left. One went away. So we should have 7 eventually. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. Okay, cool. We got 7. All right, everybody's logged in, right? Good? Yeah? Okay. All right. So this is a review of last week, okay? And you're going to have 20 seconds to answer. I'll read them out to you. What does the Greek word apologia mean? You've got apostle, apology, defense, or proclamation. All right. Got some confident answers. Ooh, yes, it's a defense, okay? So apologia means the defense, and we kind of talked about how that happens in the Greek court, right? Okay. Maria's on top. Next. So what is the reference for the verse that defines the spirit of apologetics? These aren't going to be easy, guys. You might recognize some of these references, and you can maybe do process of elimination. Jeremiah 29:11, Isaiah 41:10, 1 Peter 3:15, and Philippians 4:13. Is it too small up there? Yeah, it's too small? Oh, then you guys you might have to come up to the front row. Oh, that's rough. Okay, it's 1 Peter 3:15. So you might recognize Jeremiah 29:11. That's my favorite verse because God knows the plans that he has for you. And then Isaiah 41:10, fear not, Philippians 4:13 is I can do anything in Christ who strengthens me, right? Okay. And then 1 Peter 3:15, does anybody remember the verse or the vibe of that verse? What was the spirit of apologetics? Why are we studying this? Why are we being asked to study this? Remember what it says? Be prepared to give a defense, right? For all those who ask you, for the joy that you have in you, in meekness, right? Okay. All right. Yeah, still on top. Nice. Okay. What's the spiritual purpose of apologetics? Why are we studying this? What does it help us with? Educating the world about Christianity, challenging the faith with science, increasing faith depth by removing doubt, or coming to Christ's defense? Yeah, well, increasing faith depth by removing doubt. Okay, that's the purpose of this. That's what we're trying to do. We don't need to come to Christ's defense. He doesn't need us to defend him, right? We're doing this for us, mostly, right? For us to be able to defend the thoughts in our minds, right? And so we're trying to increase the depth of our faith by removing the doubt that we have, by truly understanding what evidence we have for our Creator, for our religion, right? Okay, next. All right. Apologetics is categorized into how many levels? 1, 2, 3, or 4? You might remember that diagram that we had. Yes, 4. Very good. Yeah, so it's 4 levels. Remember, level 1 is the question about whether God exists. Level 2 is the question of whether Christianity is the right religion. Level 3 is whether the apostolic or orthodox Christianity is the right religion. And finally, level 4 is within our own faith, increasing the depth in our own faith, right? Okay. Natalie just took the lead. Oh, man. Okay, the following question best defines which level of apologetics. How do we justify our belief that God exists? I literally just said this, like just a second ago. So you have level 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, the following question best defines which level of apologetics. How do we justify our belief that God exists? And time's up. Yeah, level 1. So, yes. So again, the 4 levels. How do we justify our belief that God exists? How do we justify our belief in Christianity as the true religion? How do we justify our belief in apostolic or orthodox Christianity? And finally, how do we justify our own belief and increase the depth in our faith? Okay. Natalie, killing it, holding the lead. Which subjects are we using to study level 1 of apologetics? Dogma, rites and tradition, science, geography and mathematics, language, history and philosophy, or science, history and philosophy? Very good. Yes, science, history, and philosophy. Last week we took science, and we took a part of the history, and today we're going to finish up history and go on to philosophy next week. Natalie's killing it. What a streak. Okay, 4 more questions. What are 2 types of complexity that we observe when intelligent agents act? Spiritual complexity and created complexity, extreme complexity and intelligent complexity, specified complexity and irreducible complexity, or original complexity and irreducible complexity. Bless you. Very good. Yes. So, I think there was some confusion on this one. So the 2 complexities, remember the magnets that we put on the refrigerator? Wow, There's just a lot of sneezing happening. Yeah, take a seat. Welcome. So remember the magnets on the refrigerator? Remember that? There was two types of complexity that we notice when intelligent agents act. One is that it's specified complexity, that it seems to be leading you to something specific, right? That it looks like someone had come by and rearranged those letters, and they're too complex to have just happened randomly, right? And then the other is irreducible complexity, that means that those letters, when they're arranged in that way, have a specific meaning, but also that you couldn't change those letters and still have the same meaning, right? Okay, so those are important. So keep that in mind. Nice. Natalie, holding it. Which one of these is not a step of the scientific method? Determine cause and effect, develop a hypothesis, make a conclusion, or test a hypothesis. Not a step. Nice. Nice. All right, so you guys pay attention in school, but yes, so determine cause and effect. It's not, right? And the reason I put this here is specifically not part of the scientific method. The goal of the scientific method is not to determine cause and effect, right? It's to determine relationships. And so for example, we used the shower analogy last time, right? When we see the steam in the shower, we can test that, and we will eventually learn that the steam may mean, most likely it means that the water is hot, right? Remember that? But that doesn't mean that the steam is causing the water to be hot, right? It just means that there's a relationship. So that's what the purpose of the scientific method is, to determine a relationship, but not cause and effect necessarily, right? Okay, I think we have one more question, friends. Oh, sorry, two more. Which of these pairs are correct? Actual events and subjective, actual events and objective, recording of events and objective, and opinions about events, objective. So you might remember when we talked about history and historical sources. Right, so actual events are the objective nature of history, right? Actual events are the objective, right? Remember, objective and subjective. Objective is like the things that actually happened, the fact, the truth, the thing that was there. Subjective is like what the person who's encountering that event or writing about that event, what they think about it, and or how they're evaluating it, you know? So for example, we talked about the telephone game, and we know that the very first whisper is the objective event. That's the thing that happened. Everything else after that is subjective, right? Is because they're taking, they're every step of the way, they're like interpreting what the last person said. So those are subjective, right? So actual events are objective, recording of events are subjective, opinions about events are subjective. Does that make sense? Cool? Okay. Okay, let's regroup because before the last question, because I feel like I lost everybody. So, does that make sense? Objective versus subjective, actual events versus not an actual event, but rather an opinion about it. Okay. Last question, Natalie. Martin's on his way though. Where can we find the Pre-Paulene Creed in the Holy Bible? And so this is another tough question. 2 Timothy 2, 1 through 4, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11, 2 Thessalonians 1, 12 through 20, and 1 Peter 3, 15 through 20. Wow, yeah, okay, a lot of you got that one. Very good. So the Pre-Paulene Creed is found in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11. Does anybody remember what that was about or what that thing was? Anyone want to talk to me about it? What was the Pre-Paulene Creed? No? Everybody's looking at their phones. You can look it up and then tell me about it if you like. Is somebody looking it up? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
You say that, well, obviously it's not the Pre-Paulene Creed, but it was inspired by Jewish heritage. We talked about that, and it had like Jewish language, even though Paul lived in Gentile lands. And then, yeah, and it was like, it's not the creed we use, but it seemed to be heavily inspired by the Jewish religion.
Yes, very good. That was correct.
So it was like a subjective view of like how Christ like died for our sins and like how it was inspired from the scriptures and yeah, just talking about like how Christ was died for.
Yes. So yes. So it's and very good. But so it's important to understand the significance, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to use historical stuff, right? Things that happen in history, whether in the Bible or outside of the Bible, to decide whether the things that were said in the Bible could be true historically, or whether like all of the stuff that happened in the New. Because imagine what would happen to your faith if we found out somehow that none of that happened, right? That none of the activities in the gospel had actually happened the way that they were written. That would be difficult to defend, right? So, in fact, it's the reverse. We are able, through history and through historical sources, we are able to go back and say, oh, it's a pretty good chance that all of these things happen the way that it was written in the Bible. And this is one of those pieces. So the Pre-Paulene Creed, yes, it's a biblical reference, but it has a historic origin. So the concept is this. If someone told you, okay, how about this? I thought I put it in the last, I thought I put it in the last presentation, but I don't think I did. So here's the concept, okay? So let's say, Natalie, so let's say someone came to you and said to you, they increased gas prices to $10 today, this morning, right? But you didn't pass by a gas station or you didn't pay attention and you didn't look at gas prices, but you saw that it was $10. Or that someone else told you that it was $10, right? Okay, you have some evidence in your mind. You're like, oh yeah, gas prices have been going up, right? So that's one piece. But the other piece is, let's say that happens, and then you walk away from that person, right? They tell you that thing about $10 gas prices, and then you walk away from them, and then someone else randomly, like you don't even know this person, but they came up and be like, oh man, I'm really upset about these $10 gas prices. Are you more likely to believe now that the gas prices really are $10? Yeah, because you had like two independent sources coming to you telling you roughly the same thing, right? So that's exactly what's happening here with the Pre-Paulene Creed. It suggests that not only do we have this like story in the gospel about Christ's crucifixion, death, and resurrection in the gospel, but also some guy out in Gentile lands, who we know as St. Paul, some guy out there wrote something in one of his books, in one of his epistles, 1 Corinthians 15, 1:11, that makes it seem like he heard it from somewhere else. Meaning that, yes, it was written in the Gospels, but also some guy who we know wrote this somewhere way far away, heard about this thing that happened. That makes it more likely for me and you to start to think, if that's the case, then maybe these things really did happen, right? If other people started to hear that this was happening, right? And so that's what we're going to do the rest of today is we're going to talk about how history can help us with this. So in third place, we have Maria. In second place, we have Martin. And in first place, we have Natalie. Congrats, guys. All right. So let's go ahead and get started on this week. And so you can keep in mind, those questions will probably show up on an exam somewhere. Okay. Welcome to week 2. So this is what we're going to try to accomplish today, looking at some historical sources and also the Shroud of Turin. Woo. Okay. So we talked a little bit about this written versus non-written sources. So there are historical accounts and Holy Scripture and birth and death records and so on and so forth that were all written historical sources that we can use to help us learn about the past, right? Also, there's non-written sources. These are kind of like the archaeological sources, right? The burial sites, tombs, ruins, pottery, midden, which is the trash, like ancient trash, right? We can even use trash to help us learn about the past, and tools and weapons, right? Okay, so we're going to focus on some archaeological sources first, and then we're going to move on to some written sources. So I put here, before we talk about each section, I want you to understand the question that we're trying to answer, because that can really help you understand the value of the thing that we're talking about, okay? So in this section, the question that we're trying to answer is, what historical evidence can we use to support our belief about Christ's birth, okay? So there is what's called Luke's census. Does anybody know what a census is? What's a census? Anybody ever fill out a form that said census at the top? Anybody know what that is? What's that? It's like the population count. Yeah, so a census is like a survey that goes out to all the people living in an area. Very good. And basically, not only does it count the number of people in each house, right, to help us get an estimate of how many people live in a place, but also that you take down certain information that's important to know for the population, for example, your educational level, how much money you make, whether you're employed or not, so on and so forth, so that we can say in Rancho Cucamonga, this many people live here, and this many people have jobs, and so on and so forth, okay? So that's what a census is. And in this case, Luke is talking about a census in his gospel in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. It's not his census, but rather it was Caesar Augustus that had released a census during a specific time. And so we've heard about the census before. This is the command that Joseph and the Virgin Mary took to go back to their birthlands to complete the census. So in these days, when a census was released, which was common actually, and we're going to talk about that. When a census was released, they said, okay, everybody has to go back to their place. Not only do they have to be present so they can be counted, but they also have to give taxes. So they have to physically go back there, and that's what caused that journey to Bethlehem, right? And that's also where Jesus was born. So that's a very important piece of our history of Christ. So taking a census was common at the time of Christ. This is a historical fact. People were required to return home to complete the process. That's something else that we can justify with history. Then there's this really important piece of archaeology called the Titulus Venidus. This is this kind of the inscription of it on the right here. It's an ancient inscription. It indicates that a census did take place. Like this census that we're talking about on Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 5 may be this one that we're actually seeing documented here, because there was a census that took place in about the 5th or 6th year AD, which is roughly the time that we would expect that to be the case. And so the date of the census that Luke refers to could have been in that exact period of time and help determine the date of Christ's birth. Okay, so that's the Titulus Venidus and Luke's census and how they come together. This census, if you were to translate it, you'd see that it's you see in the middle there's that QVIRINI. Do you see that? It's somewhere in the middle. It's kind of small, but it's the Greek for Quirinius, who we think is the governor of the village at that time. And so that would place us in the exact period of time that we're talking about with Christ's birth. So that's a helpful piece of information in archaeological history there. So what historical evidence can we use to support our belief about Christ's crucifixion? And we're going to talk a lot about that when we get to the Shroud of Turin. But At first here, we have a couple of things. And first thing is about some of the specifics about the crucifixion. So we know in Thomas's testimony in the Gospel of John that, so the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." So actually through this, we learn a little bit about the crucifixion that we don't actually get otherwise. This is one of the only places in the Bible that actually says that he was nailed in his hands. And it does in some of the crucifixion part of the gospel, it does come up, but this is kind of a very clear way of understanding. So there were nails in his hands, right? Okay, so what historical evidence can we use to support that? Well, what about someone else, or what crucifixions look like in general? Did they actually nail people's hands? Did they nail people's feet? And so there was a discovery of this body of a man that existed many years ago named Yohanan. And his body was discovered by accident in June of 1968. And they got his name because it was inscribed on the ossuary, which is the box of all the skeletal remains. And so they found that there is a nail in his heel, and that he had evidence of having been crucified. So it looked like this nail had been driven through both of the heels, which is how we understand that Christ was likely crucified. And so there are some images here that can kind of give you an understanding of like how they think that this may have occurred, because the challenge to this was that there was not a clear nail hole in the other heel. But if you see how things could have been used, like a plank of wood to support the foot, then you'll see that you'd only need one nail to get both feet, right? And then there was a piece of wood found at the end of the nail, so when they looked at it microscopically, there was wood there. And then there was evidence of nail in the arm too, because the bone that was there in his arm, it appeared to have been scratched by a nail having been there. So for this section and for when we get to the Shroud of Turin, it's a little bit graphic. So we're gonna, talk about some about how the Christ's body, his suffering and his passion. And so obviously if it's difficult, sometimes you can decide to leave and take a break and come back. What historical evidence can we use to support our belief about Christ's resurrection? So of course we have faith in the resurrection, about what happened and about the saving that happened in that moment, that he was our Savior. But what about the events surrounding it, right? So there's two pieces here, and I'll summarize this for you. In Matthew chapter 27 and 28, we learn about the fact that the tomb was sealed and then later and guarded, because they were worried that these Christ follower people were going to come and steal the body, right? Because Christ had prophesied that he was going to resurrect after the third day. He told people that he was going to resurrect after the third day. Because of that, the Jews were concerned. So they put guard and they sealed the tomb and said, we don't want people stealing the body and making people believe in this funny thing that the Christians are believing in. And then later on, it was found that his body was not there. And there was then this scheme to prove or to demonstrate that the Christians had stolen the body. So you can see in the first section, on the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, saying, "Sir, we remember while he was still alive, how that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore command that the tomb be secure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.' So the last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard, go your way, make it secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard, right? So you can tell what they were worried about, that these people were going to steal this body and deceive people, right? Then, now Christ has been crucified, he died, he was buried, the tomb was sealed, there were guards there, and now the discovery Sunday morning is that his body's not there. So now while they were going, behold, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all the things that had happened. When they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, so they bribed them. Tell them, his disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and make you secure. So they took the money and did as they were instructed, and this saying is commonly reported amongst the Jews until this day. So you can see the scheme, right? They bribed these security guards to kind of disseminate this lie about the Christians having stolen his body. So what historical artifacts do we have to support this claim here? So you kind of have to stretch with me a little bit. So there's what's called the Nazareth Decree. This is a 15 by 24 inch marble slab. It's the one you see on the right, in Greek. And it was discovered in 1878. It's currently in the Louvre, so you can go to Paris, France, and you can go see it. And it's dated sometime either in the 1st century BC or AD, but most likely in the year 41 to 54 AD at the time of Claudius. And this Claudius guy was an interesting guy. He was very curious about other peoples and other religions and other mindsets, and was also a little bit anxious about his own governorship. And so he wrote in this basically a new decree that says, "It is my pleasure that graves and tombs remain perpetually undisturbed, and the offender be sentenced to capital punishment." So previously, if this happened, then you would get a fine. But after this happened, the decree now is that you are sentenced to capital punishment, which means that you're executed, means that you're killed, right? So why did this happen, and why does this have any relevance to what we're talking about? So I want you to imagine that, how about this? Let's say you have a pet dog, okay? And you are in another room doing homework or something, okay? But then you hear your mom or dad or someone else yelling at the dog, right? Just saying, "Hey, why did you do that?" Or "Stop doing that." Or "If you do that again, I'm gonna do this and that to you," right? If you heard that, what would you immediately think? What happened? The dog did something, right? All I had to hear was someone else say something, punish someone else. And now I know, or I have evidence to believe that the dog did something, or that something happened, right? So what we're trying to put forth here with this one is to say that because this decree was released after the death of Christ, we think that this happened because he heard about what happened with these Christians stealing the body of Christ, and then released this decree to say, don't steal bodies anymore, right? So it justifies our belief in that gospel, the understanding of our gospel. So if Jesus resurrects and Jews counteract that with a report of early Christians stealing the body from a sealed grave, Claudius learns of this and then creates a new decree against this in Nazareth. So that helps to bring strength to that argument, right? There's also some archaeological evidence that basically locate, this is factual, so we know exactly where the pools of Bethsaida and Siloam were. So Bethsaida, the pool of Bethsaida, what happened there? Does anybody know? Does anybody remember pool of Bethsaida? Vicky thinks she knows? Okay. Okay, the blind man was healed at the pool of Siloam, and there was another man that was healed at the pool of Bethsaida, or Bethesda. Paralyzed man. Okay, very good. Yes. So that's on the left is the location of a church that's right over the pool of Bethesda, and the pool of Siloam was discovered in the 1800s, and it's right there, and you can visit it. There's also a question of whether Pontius Pilate actually existed. Was he a real person in Roman history? And yes, there is some evidence to show that this man existed. There's a couple of strong pieces of evidence. One is what's called the Pilate stone, which is he has a decree. And you can see I've tried to show you in that orange box, but if you look really closely, you'll see Pilate, V, which is a U, S, right? Pilatus. And so that is etched in stone, and we can understand that as one of his decrees at that time. And so that does give us some proof that he existed. There's also coins that were minted during his time and had his name on there. So that helps us, again, to give evidence to the fact that Pontius Pilate truly existed. Okay, so now we're going to get into some written sources. There are ancient non-Christian sources, government official sources, Jewish sources, and Gentile sources. So we're going to start with the ancient non-Christian sources. And as I promised, every week I'm going to give like something that you guys can just not truly as homework, but for funsies, look at home. This is a video, so last time was a little article. I just want to get a sense, did anybody actually read that article or plans to read it maybe? Plans to read it, okay, good. This one's a video, it's short, it's 8 minutes. It's Abuna Anthony Murad, and there's a really good website that actually has a lot of good explanations for apologetics. It's called CopticOrthodoxAnswers.org. But part of this video is, how do we know that Jesus Christ really existed? So he's going to talk about some similar things that we talk about here, but I think he does it very punchy, and it's very good to help you understand like how we put those pieces together. But it's an 8-minute video, so it's not too bad. Okay, who is Cornelius? Okay, so this is Tacitus. This is a famous man. He was a Roman historian who lived through like 6 different Roman emperors, so he has a lot of valuable historical information. And he wrote 2 major pieces, the Annals and the Histories. And so the Annals bridge Augustus' death to Nero's death, and the Histories bridge Nero's death to Domitian's death. He references Christians, these people called Christians, in both of the pieces, but the main reference is in the Annals. And so here's what we learn from Tacitus about Christians, who, again, remember, this is a non-Christian source. This is just a historian that wrote down a bunch of stuff. So he tells us that Christians were named for their founder, who is Christus from the Latin, who was put to death by the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. His death ended the superstition for a short time, so people stopped believing in the superstition for a short time, but it broke out again, especially in Judea where the teaching had its origin. And his followers carried this doctrine to Rome, and after the Great Fire of Rome, Nero placed the blame on the Christians. And this follows the gospel very well. This part here, the death ended the superstition for a short time, but it broke out again. You might be able to interpret this, like if you think about it from a literary sense, similar to the way the resurrection happened, right? That he was dead for 3 days, but then he resurrected. Flavius Josephus, this gentleman was a Jewish historian. So this is a Jewish source, but in this case, we're looking at it as an ancient source, so at the time of Christ. A Jewish historian and Pharisee, and he was a court historian for the Emperor Vespasian. And he wrote this: at this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. It's almost like a verbatim from our Orthodox Creed, right? This is like what we believe, and it was written by someone who doesn't believe, right? That this person wrote history as a fact, and so it's very important. There are several pieces here. A wise man called Jesus. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. People who followed him did not abandon their discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after the crucifixion, not 2 days, not 7 days, not 9 days, 3 days, and that he was alive. And accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, perhaps, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders, that he did wonders and miracles, right? Okay, wow, well, that supports what we believe. So written sources, now we're going to go on to government officials. So this is Pliny the Younger. This gentleman was a Roman author and administrator, and he was a governor. Okay, this is important. So he was a governor. He had his adopted father was called Pliny the Elder, and he started to get concerned that with this whole Christian thing that was happening near him, that pagan temples and festivals were deserted. Why is that a problem for someone who's a governor, Pliny? Why is that a problem if people aren't going to the temples and festivals and stuff? Profit, exactly. So he's losing money, right? So when you go to the temples, you donate, where does that money go? And if you go to the festivals and they make money, where does that money go? Those are taxes, those are money to the government, right? And he's the governor. So of course he's concerned about that, right? Okay, so now he has to do something about this Christianity thing. So he says, so we know why he probably really did this, but he said, so that multitudes may be reclaimed from error, so we can stop making people, so we can stop people from making mistakes, he decided to execute Christians if they did not deny their faith. And so there's this section here that he basically writes that describes how he would deal with how he would deal with Christians. That is not the section here. Sorry. This is something else that he wrote, and I want you to read this and tell me that it's not Sundays for us, right? The Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang alternate verses, a hymn to Christ, right? So the doxologia, right? We know that that's alternate verses. In a hymn to Christ, we say hymns as to a God, so we're treating him like a God, a deity, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. Essentially, the fact that Christians take an oath, right, that we follow the commandments to never commit sins, right? And after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, a Rebbe meal, right? But food of an ordinary and an innocent kind. And at this point, Pliny adds that Christianity attracted persons of all societal ranks, all ages, both sexes, and from both the city and the country. So there's a lot of important information here, but basically this talks about what the early Christian church was like, right? Which is almost identical to how we practice. Does that make sense? Okay. So thank you, Pliny. Even though he killed Christians, he wrote something here that really gives us an idea of what the early Christian church looked like. So Emperor Trajan was one of his friends. He's taking a selfie in this statue. So one of the earliest selfies ever known. Okay. He used to talk to Pliny. He was the Roman emperor and a great military leader, and he agreed with Pliny how he decided to deal with Christians, but he made some restrictions. He said Christians should not be sought out or tracked down. Repentance coupled with worship of the gods, meaning if they said that they weren't Christians, that they didn't believe in Christ, and they worshiped the pagan gods, that was enough to clear them. Pliny had some doubts about this. And then Pliny should not honor any lists. If someone came to him with a list of Christians and said, these people need to go, that he shouldn't honor that unless that person comes out and outs themselves, right? So this was the very early age of what was considered persecution for the Christians. And actually, this wasn't a bad era for Christians. Overall, Christians were treated relatively well, just like a lot of people looked at them like, oh, you're weird. You're just weird. But it's fine. It wasn't until this kind of started, that persecution, that things started to change. So though persecution existed, it's actually one of the better Roman periods for Christians. There was an Emperor Hadrian too. He's an important figure. He also had to figure out how to deal with Christians. So he wanted to make sure that Christians were dealt with fairly. And so he said, if accused, Christians should not skip trial. The accusations should be examined. You should investigate all the accusations. The Christians should not be harassed in the process, and officials should present evidence against the Christian accused, not just outcries. Okay? So that helps us to support the fact that Christians existed at the time and they were persecuted, like we've already learned, right? So now we're going to go into some Jewish sources. So there's what's called the Talmud, right? This is a compilation of Jewish oral tradition. So in the very early period, in the ancient period, in the mid 2nd century, they started to put together this thing called the Talmud. So one piece of it was called the Mishnah, and that was completed in 200. And then there was an interpretation of that was written called the Gemaras. And the combination of those things are called the Talmud. So what does it say in the Talmud about Christ? So on the eve of the Passover, Yeshu, Jesus, was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf." But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. And so when we look at the word hanged, we're like, that's an interesting choice of word. But it's actually not an uncommon word to describe what happened to Christ. There were several parts, not only in biblical scripture, but also outside of that use the word hang when they're talking about being hung on the cross. So you can see here in Galatians, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." Okay? Finally, so that was the Jewish source. This is in the Talmud. The Talmud is like a highly, highly sacred document in the Jewish tradition, right? So the Talmud, they have it in a gold box, and it's in scroll form, and they read it in their services. So it's very important. And the fact that this is in there gives some evidence that this actually happened, right? Considering the fact that it was at the hands of the Jews that this happened. And lastly, we're going to talk about some Gentile sources. So Lucian was a Greek satirist. Does anybody know what satire is? What is a satirist? Yeah?
Makes fun of a situation or over-exaggerates the situation to the point where it's unbelievable.
Yeah, right. It makes things ridiculous, right? So he has this sarcastic or tongue-in-cheek style. It's like comedy during that time. That's how comedy took form, right? It's just in satire. And so he used to make fun of Christians. But just like Pliny, for example, even though people didn't like Christians, they still wrote about them. And we can learn a lot by that. So here's what he wrote. "The Christians, worship a man to this day." So this will be making fun of Christ, but also telling about him. "The distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see these misguided creatures," that's us, "start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage," that's Christ, "and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all the worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property." So this is a testimony of our belief, right? That we believe in a crucified sage, and that we worship him till this day, and that he introduced these novel rites that we see as the church, and that he was crucified on our account. And so this guy who's totally not even in the same era as Christ, who's making fun of Christians, he writes this, and it supports what we believe historically, right? Okay, I'm going to take a quick pause. I recognize that last section is a little bit dry, but it's important stuff. But we'll take a quick second. I want to see if there are any questions. You had any thoughts about that? Does everybody does it make sense to everybody why we looked at that? Why that was important? Why do we care? Yeah? No? I get some nods. Anybody else? Who has a question? Give me a question, and maybe we can answer it. This is the Shroud of Turin. Well, we're going to get too into the Shroud of Turin. But it's another historical source, but we're going to mix it with science. And so this is where our first section and our second section meet. But in the interest of time, I'm going to just try to finish this up here. No. What? Cancel. Okay, cool. So the Shroud of Turin, okay? Has anybody heard of this thing? Nobody knows what it is? Okay, does anybody know what a shroud is? Shroud? Give me a sense. Take a guess what shroud means. A tree? Okay, not a tree. A shrine, it's close. So a shroud is like a piece of linen or a cloth that is used to wrap usually a person, and it's usually a very important piece of cloth, right? So, for example, you can even consider, even though it's not quite what a shroud is, a veil, like an osharb, is like a shroud, okay? What else is like a shroud? If you've ever been to a wedding in our church and they put the cloaks over the bride and the groom, that's like a shroud, okay? But where does this become important when we talk about the history of Christ? Is actually the burial shroud. So the burial shroud is where you're going to talk most about the word shroud. So that's what a shroud is. Does anybody know what Turin is? No? Turin is a city in Italy. Okay, so this is called the Shroud of Turin, and we'll talk about why it's called that and what it is, okay? So this is kind of the image that gives you an understanding of what the shroud is, right? So it's this piece of cloth that Christ was wrapped in, okay? And so it's 436 centimeters by 110 centimeters. It's a linen sheet with a herringbone weave. So you can tell this has been studied all the way down to like how many centimeters and how many fibers. It's like this highly studied cloth in history, okay? So it has frontal and dorsal is back, imprints of a man who has died after being crucified. So regardless of who is in this cloth, it portrays, it gives us evidence of a man who is wrapped in it who was crucified. It's clear from Holy Scripture that Jesus Christ was wrapped in a sheet after his death. So we know from all these references that he was wrapped in a sheet. And so here's the path that this shroud took. So we believe it started in Jerusalem, that this was Christ's shroud, Christ's burial shroud, and that it was moved in the 6th century to Edessa, which is modern-day Turkey, eventually to Constantinople, that it was seen in Constantinople a couple of times in the medieval period up until the 13th century. And then in the 14th century, it appears in France, and it was taken to a church in France called the Altar of Sainte-Chapelle in Chambéry, France, and this was in the early 1500s. And then there's a fire in 1532 that burns it slightly, and it was repaired. And then ultimately, it was then transferred to the Italian city of Turin by the Duke Emmanuel Philibert, in 1578. From there, it's been the Shroud of Turin ever since. In 1978, many years later, there was an exposition for examination of this cloth where it was studied, okay? And this picture here is of pollen. So they have used pollen studies to detect all the pollen that's been on this shroud and have been able to trace it back this exact trip that we think happened. So that this shroud was in a church that had a fire, that it was in France because that's the pollen count in France and the type of pollen that you find in France, and so on and so forth. So all the way back to its origins, okay? So that they've used pollen studies to help make sure that this is actually accurate information. So this is kind of like a map of how this shroud has traveled. So initially in Jerusalem, then Edessa, Constantinople, then Lire in France, Chambéry, and then finally Turin. Okay, so this is the image Has anybody seen this before? Does anybody have a weird picture of this in their house somewhere? I think a lot of people, I know I had this. So this is like this image on the right you may have seen before. This is the image from the Shroud of Turin. And this is a very important image to help us start to figure out what was going on here. So this was, we call this a photographic negative. Does anybody know what that is? It's not a bad thing. It's not negative, but what is a negative? Yeah. So there was a time where in school they taught us how to develop photographs. They probably don't do this for you guys anymore, but so there was a thing. Like in middle school, they would take us to a dark room. It's called a dark room, and you get the negatives, the film, like you said. So you take the film from a camera that cannot be exposed to light, otherwise it would ruin the photo, right? So you take the film out of the camera in a dark room, and you put it in a couple of chemicals, and then it will start to show you the reverse, right? So that's the negative. So the film is the negative. The picture that we want to see is the positive. And so what we're seeing on the left here is the shroud, which is considered a negative in this case. So the shroud is on the left. It's the negative. And then if you were to flip the colors, you get the image on the right, which is like the positive. And so you can see the image of a man, right? The face shape. And you can see a little bit of dark staining right over the forehead. That helps us to learn about blood, what blood would look like on the shroud. And this is similar to the location where we would expect the crown of thorns, right in there. And so what? What does that mean? Well, let's study this a little bit more. How did that image get there? How did that happen? How did we get an image on this shroud? Anybody want to take a guess? Sweat or blood. So blood for sure, right? Sweat would evaporate and probably not leave this where we can actually turn it into right? Because it's been 2,000 years since this cloth existed, right? So sweat would evaporate. How would it, and not only that, so sweat, right? So, okay, let's say sweat happened. Then if I look at it microscopically, I should find sweat particles, right? Because sweat is a combination of dry skin and chloride ions and so on. So I should find that there. Okay, what else? If it's not sweat, if it's not blood, how did that image get printed on there? Maybe a holy light in the moment of resurrection that cast an image on this cloth, okay? But that's just something to consider. So, but how did that get there? So, people will say it's a painting, right? Is it a painting? Well, we're going to say it's not a painting, and here's why. So there's no preferred directionality, which means that the front and the back look roughly the same. And there's, on a painting, if you were to hold the canvas like this, you could easily look at the side and tell me which side the paint is on and which side the paint's not on, right? In this case, no. There is no directionality to it. There's no pigment, so this is to answer your question about sweat. There's no pigment, there's no carrier, there's no brushstrokes, there's no clumping of material between the fibers or threads, and there's no cracking. But as far as the sweat goes, there was nothing found between the fibers. And there's no cracking. So you can look, does anybody recognize this, the two pairs of eyes on top? It's the Mona Lisa, right? The Mona Lisa is it's probably just 500 years old. This cloth is 2,000 years old. The Mona Lisa is cracking. We should expect this to crack also, because at the time, really all we're using to paint would be oil painting, right? And that's all cracking. So, and the discoloration of the fibers is only 0.4 microns deep. So they've taken these fibers from this cloth, they've dissected it, and have found that it's only about 0.4 microns deep, how the certain areas are discolored, right, to make the image. And so they couldn't have been sewn in that way, right? Because that would be the whole thread would be a certain color and dyed that way. But in this case, it's only the surface of that fiber. So we also find a 3D image. So this is a 2D thing. It's a piece of cloth, right? But there is a 3D image. This is very interesting. So this is very different from anything else you've seen. So the brightness of the image on the shroud is proportional to the cloth to body distance. So what does that mean? That means the closer the cloth would have been to somebody who had this cloth on their face, the closer it was, the brighter it is on the image, which doesn't make a lot of sense for cameras, right? When we take a picture on our camera, what's the brightest point on the image? The brightest point on the image was the brightest point that we're seeing, right? So like, for example, if I took a picture of this window, the brightest point would be where the light is coming through, like the white part of that glass, and so on and so forth, right? So that would be the brightest point. But in this case, no, the brightest point is just related to how close that thing is to their face, to the body, right? And so what we're seeing on the right here is if you were to plot the intensity of that brightness against the location of the point, then you can actually make that 3D image, right? So we can see that there's you can see a face, but it's not only is it 2D, it's 3D as well, okay? So now we're going to talk about the blood. So this is more of what the shroud looks like. So remember, this shroud is long enough because it covered a person front and back. So what we're seeing here would be the side that's considered the front. And you can see where the face was, the chest is, the hands, how they're crossing over the middle, and then the start of the legs, right? And so there are also some blood prints. Can anybody see blood prints? Exactly right. The right hand, so the right hand is over the left hand, and we're seeing a dark spot right there on the wrist. If you also look on the side, that there was a dark spot there as well, right? Okay, so we're going to talk about that. So it was confirmed by several physicians and scientists in the 70s and 80s to be authentic blood. So they found heme products. Heme is what? Iron. So they found iron products that would signify that is blood. The blood prints match the locations where Christ was known to have bled. So the areas that we're seeing on the shroud that have blood prints are the chest wound, so we can see that there, the hand and forearms, the foot imprint, so we can't see it on here, and also the crown of thorns on the head. Okay, this is kind of hard to look at, but I want to give you a sense because this helps to understand why the blood prints on the shroud might not make a ton of sense when you first look at it. So the torture of the crucifixion is horrible. And and learning about it from a medical perspective, I can tell you it's horrific. What the person would have to go through. But one thing is that they're not able in that position. When you let gravity do the work, you are unable to breathe, right? Because the muscles, and what it's showing you here is that there are muscles between our ribs and under and right at the base of our chest. That's called the breathing muscles, the intercostal muscles, and the diaphragm. And those cannot operate if by gravity you are being stretched in this way. So you can tell by gravity. So in order to breathe, he would have to push up on his feet to pick himself up, and then to pick himself up so he can take a breath, and then he can let himself drop again. And so every breath would have to be this movement. So that's going to explain why we see the blood marks the way that we see them on the shroud, okay? So also you can see areas in the head and the upper back. So the thorns would have lacerated the occipital artery, which is the artery that we see in the back here, the squiggly one all the way in the back of the head. That's called the occipital artery, and that's where you're seeing a little bit of the blood print on the shroud. Also, can anybody tell me what you see in the lower part there? What does it look like? What part of the body is it, Tayyib? Maybe the back, right? Looks like the back. Does anybody see any marks on there? Yeah. Okay, I see the, so what were you trying to show us, George? The whipping, right? So the scourging, the scourge marks are seen on the back and more in the shoulders. So if you see them more in the shoulders, it signifies that this person probably carried that horizontal beam of the cross that we think happened with Christ, right? And then there's an overlapping pattern. So the overlapping pattern tells us that there were two executioners, one from this side and one from that side, right? And then this is like a full look at the Shroud of Turin and all the different marks on there and how we can use this to help resemble Christ. So does anybody do you kind of understand what the shroud is now and kind of what we're doing and what we're talking about here? That kind of makes sense so far. So you can see that there were several, and you can see all those marks were marks or scourge marks. So, okay. There has been debate. This Shroud of Turin has been debated since the beginning of time. It's like crazy how much debate has been about this. One of those things has been the carbon dating of this. So has anybody heard of carbon dating before? Yeah? Anybody have an idea what carbon dating is? No? Okay. So carbon dating is the concept that we can use the carbon atoms in this cloth to decide how long ago it existed, okay? So it's the concept that over time, carbon starts to release electrons, and all of a sudden it starts to become an isotope of itself, okay? So carbon has isotopes. Does anybody remember what isotopes are? No? Lose a neutron, exactly. So basically that it has the same number of protons, same number of electrons, but that the neutrons have been changed, that they're not the same as before. So this happens. We know that this happens. We can time how long that it takes for that to happen, right? And so what happens is they test the carbon that's in this cloth, and they look at the isotope of carbon that is there, because it does happen, and then they can calculate how much time has passed since it was at its original form, right? This is flawed. Carbon dating isn't the best way to date something. The best way to date something is to literally write the date on the back. But carbon dating has been shown to be unreliable in some cases. So 3 separate labs dated the shroud to be from the 1200s. So that doesn't make sense for what we believe, right? So if this happened, this shroud is from the 1200s, which means that there was a crucified man in Jerusalem in the 1200s, which doesn't really match up with history. But in either case, if that's what they're saying, then we should be able to refute that in some way. So there are sources of error. Carbon dating has been shown to be incorrect for known dates, meaning that if you're a carbon dating scientist and I have something where I know when this thing came from, and I bring it to you, and you do the carbon dating and you are off, then we know that you're off, right? Okay, so that's happened before. And they also only tested one corner of this whole cloth, which when you're doing carbon dating, it's important to test multiple sites, but they were only allowed to test one corner, so they only tested one corner. And there was lack of peer review. There weren't scientists looking over the shoulders of the people that were doing it, and there was no blinding. So when you do a study, right, you want to be blinded to the thing that you're studying. You don't want to know something about it that would influence your decision about what you're seeing. So that means when you have two cloths in front of you, if someone told you that this was the Shroud of Turin and this one wasn't, then, and if you have a bias in your mind, you might be likely to change how you decide about that thing. But if they didn't tell you which one was which, then you wouldn't know, right? So I'm sure maybe some of us have like tricked people like that before, right? Okay. And I promise we're reaching the end. This is the last couple of slides. But if you stick with me, it'll help you understand like this really important piece about the Shroud of Turin. So how do we come back and sort of refute what has happened with the carbon dating? So first off is what's called the Prey manuscripts, or the Hungarian Prey manuscripts. So this was a manuscript, initially a set of papers that was compiled by the Hungarian Boldva Monastery in the late 1100s, which would be before the time that they say that the shroud was carbon dated, right? 1260. So that this happened before that time, that makes us start to think now. Okay, so this was discovered by a guy named Georgi Prey, so that's why it's called the Prey manuscripts, and it was donated for research. And so now we have what's called the Prey Codex. So it looks, based on the way that these manuscripts were drawn, these images were drawn, the iconographer that drew these icons, it looks like that person probably saw the Shroud of Turin, which would mean that the Shroud of Turin existed before the time, definitely existed before the time that they carbon dated it to be, okay? So these icons, here's why we think that the person who wrote these icons saw the Shroud of Turin. There's several similarities between the Shroud of Turin and these icons. So 1, Jesus is naked. 2, his hands are crossed over his pelvis. 3, Jesus' right hand is over his left. There's a nail bloodstain there. The thumbs are not visible, and we didn't explain why, but I can talk about that. Jesus' fingers are very long. There's a mark above the right eye of Jesus, like in a reverse 3, which is similar to the Shroud of Turin. The shroud is more than double the body's length, has a herringbone weave pattern, right? So you can see the shroud in the image has the same pattern as the shroud that exists. And then there's these holes, right? The L pattern of these burn holes. So this is what happened after the shroud got burnt. It's that image on the top right. So on the top right, you see the pattern of those 4 holes. That happened in that fire in France, and it was repaired somewhat. Then on the right of that image, you're seeing the painting that was in this Hungarian monastery. And you can see the pattern is identical and represents the similar area of the shroud that was being painted in that moment. So that helps us to decide, okay, this was drawn, this icon was written, most likely after this person saw the shroud, right? Because it bears so much similarity. And then finally, we can talk about the probability, right? Like, how crazy would it be that all of this, that we have this shroud that shows this, what looks like Jesus's body, right? But it's not Jesus's shroud. Like, let's say that, like, someone came and said that, but that's not Jesus. How do you know it's Jesus for sure? Well, here's the probability. There's a 1 in 100 chance. So this is all calculated. It's not the best calculation in the world, but it helps us to kind of understand, and I think it's somewhat realistic. So how common was it for a man to be crucified during that time? It's not that common. It was relatively rare. It was reserved for the worst of the worst of the worst, right? So during that time, we estimate maybe there was 100 people who were crucified and all of the people that were punished. And so he was one of those. And then what are the chances that in addition to that, he also had a cap of thorns? 1 in 5,000. What are the chances that he also carried the horizontal beam? Well, for folks that were crucified, probably half of them carried the beam. Probably half of them also had nails used. And then maybe 1 in 10 of them would have had a wound on the right side, and 1 in 20 would have been wrapped without being washed beforehand. And finally, that there was such a low probability that he would not have decomposed in that linen, right? So the fact that there was no evidence of decomposition, right? That the body that was in that cloth was not decomposed at all, that means that he was briefly wrapped, that he wasn't wrapped for very long at all. So that's a 1 in 500 chance. When you put that together, it's a 1 in 200 billion chance that this was for a different historical figure than the Jesus Christ that we know. So this helps us to really determine, like this Shroud of Turin, most likely 1 in 200 billion chance that it's anything else than his own shroud, okay? And that's all we have today. That's everything. Sorry, I know I went over, but I wanted to make sure we got through the history section so that next time it's a little bit more leisurely, that we don't have to go through so much material. Does anybody have questions about that? Thumbs. Okay, so there is a anatomical space in the anatomy. Okay, so there are wrist bones here. So there are 2 bones in the forearm, the radius and the ulna. Okay, so you can feel them in your arm if you feel there's 2 bones. And then once you get to the wrist, there are a handful of little bones about this big that make up all the little wrist bones. They come together with some ligaments, but they're really just like little pebbles that just like sit in there at the base of your hand right here. And there is an anatomical space that goes between them called the space of Destow. That's a French name, Destow. And the space of Destow is kind of like right in here. And that space would allow a nail to pass through it. Because it's one of the only places where you can actually go all the way through in one straight shot. So that's where they think that Christ had been nailed, was through the space of Destow. What passes through this space of Destow is called the median nerve. The median nerve innervates the thumb. So the thumb's movement, particularly this movement, which we call abduction. So when we do this, it's called abduction. The median nerve allows for the thumb to do that. So what happens if you pass a nail through that space and it hits the median nerve? It severs the nerve. The nerve doesn't work no more. So if the nerve doesn't work no more, now you can't do this. So now what is your thumb going to do? It's going to go like that, just like that. So that's why if your hands are like this, you're not going to see thumbs. That's the theory of why that would have been the case. Any other questions? Yeah. So the shroud is a very sacred cloth, right? And so even all these studies that were done on it, they were done on such small parts of the cloth because they don't want to ruin it. It's so sacred. It's one of the most sacred things that touched Christ's body, right? So the church, the museums and the churches that have taken care of it all these years only allow scientists that much to study. Of course, if you're the scientist, you'd be like, okay, if you want good carbon dating, you need to give me 3 sites. But I'm sure there was enough deliberation that basically said, we don't care about your carbon dating. You can carbon date all you want, but ultimately, this cloth is more important than your carbon dating. So I assume is what happened. I don't know for sure. Any other questions? It's an interesting topic, right? Shroud of Turin. There's a documentary. Let me see if I can pull it up. There's a documentary. It's really good, and I think makes it a lot more exciting than I did. But at least now you know all the details. The documentary kind of glazes over a lot of the details. Does anybody have that image in their home? Has anybody ever seen it before? The facial image of Christ. See, this is really popular when you look. There's a lot of framed photos of that. I think it's this one, The Mystery of the Shroud. So it's on YouTube. It's an old one. It's in 1997. But in any case, I don't really like the documentary, although it is good and interesting. It's not like the best way to learn about it, but that was one, and I've not seen this one, but Histories and Mysteries is usually pretty good too. So take a look at it, see if you can learn about it. It's like kind of an interesting historical mystery type thing. All right, friends. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for being awesome and for joining me on this journey. Next week, we're going to talk about how philosophy plays into all this, right? And so the topic there is the absurdity, how absurd it is that of a life without a God. And then you're going to go and you're going to get into level 2. Does anybody remember what level 2 is? What's the question there? What are we trying to answer in level 2 of apologetics? No? Okay, what's level 1? Anybody remember what level 1 is? What are we in right now? What are we talking about? Why are we talking about it? What's the question we're trying to answer? Okay, not just Jesus Christ, but what did we talk about more last time? What's that? We talked about evidence that what exists? That God exists, right? Okay, so does God exist? And then level 2 is going to be, okay, so let's say God exists, but why is Christianity the religion? So remember, this is the level 1, 2, 3, and 4 that I keep talking about, okay? So 1, God exists. 2, Christianity is the religion. Level 3, apostolic Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. And finally, level 4 is depth and orthodoxy. Okay, folks? All right, love you. Let's stand up for prayer, and Vicky's going to pray for us.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Thank you, God, for bringing us here together to learn about you. Thank you for leaving us this shroud so that we can learn about everything that you went through for us. Please help us to open our minds and to learn more, and so we have a good foundation for when anyone asks us about you. Through the intercessions of St. Justina and all the choirs of your saints, please hear us when we say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, and deliver us from the evil. Through Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, the glory, forever.
Thanks, guys. Safe trip home. See you next week.